now talks about English as a cross-cultural communication medium. English as a medium of cross-cultural communication. Here, today, we are going to talk about three things. First of all, culture and communication, and how English is related between to this area. So let's think about culture. So what is a culture? The culture is a pattern, and culture is something coherent, and culture is something that you learn, and culture shapes our behavior, and culture affects the way they evaluate which is more important or less important. And then when you think about the culture, we have another topic to think about: communication. So, how the culture is related to communication. It's often said that culture is so closely connected to the communication that it's even said that communication is a cultural outcome, or culture is communication. So closely related here. Then our class topic is English as a global language. So where this first, the English language. So language, what is language? Language is used to describe the culture. Language is a kind of mental thought process. And language is sometimes used to do communication. So these are the three topics that are so closely connected. So we are not going to go deeper about this one, but however, our topic is how English can be differently used according to the differences in culture. So when you are talking about relationship and culture and the communication, there is one person that we must remember. He is Edward Hall. So he introduced the concept of the context. So he tried to explain the culture by using this concept. What is the role of the context in culture? What is the differences in people's way of perceiving the context? And what's the difference between the people from different world, and how the differences in their perception about the culture can affect the way the people communicate. So in this regard, we are going to talk about the context. So what is the context? The first question is, what is the context? And the first context is kind of nonverbal communication. For example, when you are communicating, the word, there are two means to convey our messages. One is word, the other is our body. And the context is the nonverbal cues. We are sending more messages not only by the words that we are speaking, but also with our body. For example, the way that we are eye contact, and sometimes we can use the silence, and the way that we are, how to move our hands, or when you are shaking the hands. And if you have jittering legs, they would say you cannot, that's the sign that he's nervous. So this is the context. The very important is the nonverbal cue is sending out more messages than our word expresses. This is the context. And also, so if we are communicating with you, then we must think about how well do I know you? How long have you known each other? Is there any taboo topics that I shouldn't talk to you? And also, what are the physical arrangement is here? The room is too hot. The room is too cold. And also, there are many there are many, these are all the context. The context is there should be some shared background that the two communicators can share. So when it comes to context, the Edward Hall said there are two kinds of culture. So in some culture, they belong to the high context culture. In another word, in high context culture, that they depend more on the context to convey their messages. So in this culture, the nonverbal cues are very important. They are sending more messages through the eye contact, through the way they shake hands, and through the way the body posture. So this is important. And how about low context culture? In the low context culture, the word is more important than the nonverbal cues in conveying the message. The most of the message is conveyed by the words, by the use of the words. So if you belong to the low context culture, the use of the word is very important. Why? Because you depend more on the words to convey the message. So in this class, our major interest is language. So the point is, what's the difference in speaking English? If you belong to the high context culture, the use of the language, the use of English should be different from the way that those who belong to the low context culture. So this is important to note. If you belong to the high context culture, the English should be spoken in a very diplomatic way. English should be used in a way that is diplomatic. And also it should be very indirect. And also it should be implicit. So this is the way that English should be spoken or written in a way that is diplomatic. What is diplomatic? Diplomatic is that if you can say something, but you can mean another. So I've heard that in the Britain, there is Queen Elizabeth, the second Queen Elizabeth. So it has been, she became queen in 1952, and she's still queen, and his son, Prince Charles, is still prince. So some people might think, well, Prince Charles is a little bit too unfortunate because he is always prince at an age that he could have been a king. But I've heard that many British people, they tend to prefer the second Elizabeth queen to the Prince Charles. Why? Because the queen is more diplomatic than Prince Charles. So diplomatic means sometimes you're talking one thing, then you can mean another. So in British people, they belong to high context culture. So I wouldn't say that every British people, they tend to belong to the high context culture. Actually, there is more personal differences in personalities than cultural differences. But in general, the British people, they tend to be high context. And it's interesting to note that about American, they tend to be low context. So what is the low context? They depend more on the words. So therefore, you can guess what should be the way of speaking English. They should be very direct. And it should be very explicit. And it should be very precise. It could be very concise. So this is the way that you should speak or write English if you are trying to communicate with a low context communicator like USA. So it is not a coincidence that the American, that when you are learning the business English, they always emphasize the value of writing English in a way that is concise, correct, and clear. They would say in the business English writing, there are 3 C rules. This is the principle of writing or speaking English for the business purpose. They should say your English should be concise. So it shouldn't be long, and it should be accurate, it should be clear, so there should be no room for the confusion, then it should be accurate, and it should be very concise. So, is it a coincidence that the reason that we are learning English is to have access to the American leadership in business? So this is the rule of the business English. So, if you are doing the business English, you must follow the rule of the low context communicator like Americans. Then how about the British? Even though the British people, they are the same as speaker. In other words, the British people and American people both are the mother tongue speaker of English. However, their culture is not the same. Their culture is different. For example, the one example is the high context and the low context. So the cultural difference makes a difference in the way the British speak or write English and the American speak and write English. This is something that we should be aware when you are communicating with someone in the British or the American. We always think, well, British and the American and European, they are using the same or the similar English, so that is a little difference that we would believe. But however, there is a lot of differences between British English and American English. There are several reasons. One of the reasons can be found in the cultural differences. So, the context. So, let's get back to Edward Hall. Edward Hall was trying to explain the relationship between culture and the communication by introducing the concept of context. So, there are 2 kinds of culture. So, he also introduced 2 cultures. There's a high context culture and low context culture. So, let's put it on a scale. So, there are some countries that would fall on the high culture, high context end of scale. Which country do you think that will fall on the high context culture, high context end of this country? Japan, Korea, and maybe China, Asia. Then how about low context culture? Guess which country fall on the low context end of scale? Of course, Germany and the USA and the Swiss. Then how about the British? Britain fall somewhere like this. And how about France? France falls here. So it's interesting, even if the France is a European country, but France tends to fall on the high context culture like Japan. So this is interesting contrast between among the European countries. So why we are doing this, we should always find out between how the context affects the use of English when you are talking to Germany. Then we should consider when you are communicating with German, so what should be our way of speaking English? It should be correct. It should be concise. Then it should be to the word. So if you have one thing to mean, then we can speak straight forward. Then how about when you are talking Japanese? We should be very diplomatic. We should be, when you are communicating with the high context culture like Japanese or Korean, so we must interpret what they say. For example, if Japanese say it is difficult, it could often means it is impossible. But when German said it is impossible, then no more than and no less than. So it's interesting to find that there was a survey by the consulting company, and they surveyed maybe hundreds of business managers around the world, and they asked in the survey, which country would you like to do business? Then the survey outcome comes that Germany comes at the top of the survey. In other words, the business managers in the global society, they tend to prefer German or American as their preferable business partner. Why? Because maybe there could be some reasons. So one of the reasons is they belong to low context culture. That means you don't have to, when you are talking with the German or when you are talking with the American, you don't have to struggle to interpret their meaning. Just hear as they say, because what they say is what they mean. You don't have to struggle to interpret what is the meaning behind what they say. So it's very convenient, it's transparent, so it is very comfortable, and they can trust what German or American say. Anyway, let's get back to our topic is here. So please be aware the cultural differences. They can make all the difference in the way that we are talking to high context and low context people. So we're talking about Edward Hall's very famous theory on the different degree of context and then how they can affect the way that we use the English. So let's move on to another thing. When it comes to this cultural dimension, that there is another man that we must remember. His name is Geert Hofstede. Actually, he is a Dutch psychologist. In 1970s or 70s, he was the IBM HR director. So at that time, the 1960s and 70s, IBM was one of the best global company. So IBM has a lot of branch subsidiaries around the world. So if you are the HR director of IBM company, you must be traveling around the world to have an interview with these business partners in India or Europe, Latin America, or Africa, or whatever, Asia. So as an HR director, as he happened to talk to many business managers, they happen to have a huge database about answers with managers from different cultures. So he used this database and they produced a theory about the four cultural dimension. So the first one was the power. And the second one is uncertainty. The second one and third one is individualist. And versus collectivist. And also there is another thing, the masculine or feminine, but we are now focusing on this power. So, what is power? That is authority. They can use the power, and there is power holders, and there is another who should follow the power. Anyway, and he found out that every culture has a different attitude toward the power. In some culture, they show respect the power holders, and they think that power holders they have entitled to privileges, so they cannot speak, they cannot challenge the power. So if you put it the different attitude toward the power, we can put it on a scale. Let's put it on a scale here, power. So one of the cultural dimension that Hofstede used was the power. So in one culture, so there is some culture that is the high power distance. So if you belong to high power distance, that means that you are afraid of power. So you are you also think that power is unequally distributed among the members. If you belong to high power distance, that you cannot challenge your boss. You are afraid to disagree with the opinion of your boss. Why? Because the power is something that holds. So in the high power distant culture, that power is something they can use. But on the other end of the scale, there is no power, low power distance. So if you belong to the low power distance culture, even if you have a power, you tend to underplay it. You don't show your power. Why? Because in this culture, they think the power is something to share. And they don't think that the power holder is entitled to the privilege. And if you belong to low power distance, you think that power is that you can challenge your boss's opinion if you think it makes sense. So every country has different level of cultural dimension, the power. Then let's think about it. That which country will fall on the high power end of scale, and which country will fall on the low power end of scale. You can guess. So, for example, India. India typically belongs to the high power distance. That means their class is strictly divided among the high power person and low power person. If you have low power, you cannot challenge your boss. So the power division is so distinct, so segregated, then you cannot challenge your boss. And there is a very rigid, and there is a little chance of moving up, but there is a little chance of moving down the class level. So this is typically the India. Then also they say Korea in the Asian country, or Latin America, or African countries. So they tend to fall on the high power end of scale. Then how about low power end of scale? Which country do you think fall on the low power end of scale? For example, Scandinavian country. So, for example, Norway and Sweden and Finland people, so what is their life is like? Because they don't have to work hard because the welfare is so good. So they are, even if they don't have to be competitive. Because your welfare is relatively well guaranteed, so you don't have to struggle to do better than the others. In school, the children are not so competitive, and the life is relaxed. And if you're trying to struggle to do better than the others, then it is something uncomfortable. Why? Because being ordinary is good enough for the Scandinavian people, they say. Then how about Australia? The Australian people, they would feel uncomfortable if someone is trying to do better than the others. They are pushing ahead, then there will be something against their rule. They usually say. Maybe there is some history background here. The Australian people, who is the first settler, who was the old settler? So the Australia, they were prisoners. Who were the prisoners? Prisoners from London. They were the first settlers. That was the first settlers in Australia. Why? Because at the time, sometimes in the 19th centuries, there were too many prisoners, overcrowded prisons in London, because the British government thought about where should. So we have too much prisoners. We need some place to send them away. Then the British government thought about the faraway land Australia. So they began to send the prisoners there. Anyway, so this maybe that is partially explained that the Australian, they are willing to challenge authority. Because their ancestors, many of their ancestors were they were imprisoned after their rebellion failed. Anyway, the Scandinavian, Australian, they belong to the low power distant culture. So let's get back to our main point. So what's the impact of the power on the use of English? So this is a topic that we must discuss, we must consider. For example, if you are working for your low power distance boss, there should be something different in the way that you speak English from the way that you speak the high power distance boss. For example, if you try to persuade your Korean boss tend to belong to the high power distance, and they should be different from the way that you try to communicate with the American boss or Scandinavian boss, or your boss is Australian boss. There should be a difference in the way. I'm not only talking about your boss, but your communicator, partner in whatever you are doing, business, or you are addressing your international group of meeting or whatever settings, we must be aware about the cultural difference and how it can affect the way that we communicate with someone with a different culture. The English is a global language, and English is so diverse. The English is used to so many people from so different cultures. So now there are, as we have talked about, there are much more Asian speakers than the Arab speakers. In other words, there are much more people in the world, in the global society, who is speaking English as a foreign or second languages than those who are speaking English as a mother tongue. And what does it mean? The English is not only owned by the native speakers, but English is now the language of the global society from different culture. That we should be culturally fluent, and we should be culturally reshaping the way we are speaking or writing the English as we are speaking from the different people. For example, if we are talking to Indian people, then we should consider they belong to the high contest culture. So if you are trying to too democratic, or we are trying to be open-minded, could it be welcomed always in the way that the Americans would be welcoming? No, there is a difference. If you are communicating with someone who belong to the high contest culture, sometimes even if you try to democratic or trying to direct, then we should think about something else. So, for example, there is a Scandinavian manager who were sent to India. So, for example, Swedish manager, he became a new boss in India for the Indian staff. Then he came there and he spoke in English. So, nice to see you. I'm open-minded. I hope that we will be doing well. So, I'd like you to suggest me any ideas about the way to improve the way of the factory operation. He suggested, I'm always open to you. Please feel free to walk into our office and suggest any good ideas you have. So this is actually the Swedish manager to talk to the India staff. So let's think about what was his reaction from Indian workers. If that had happened in the Swedish staff, that there is no doubt they would welcome him. Wow, this is a good process, welcome. He is always willing to listen to us. This is a good sign. So I'm willing to give my opinion to him. That would be the reaction from the Swedish staff. But this is not Sweden. This is India. they reported that they surveyed the Indian staff, Indian workers, that what was your reaction to the Swedish boss's suggestion, and the Indian staff said, I feel nervous. Why? Because he's the boss. If he's the boss, what is the boss? Boss should make a decision. Boss should command us to do something. But he's asking us to our opinion. This is very strange. I feel uncomfortable. So I don't know whether I can trust this new boss. This is the way they reacted. I have another story. This is a Korean manager, and Korean manager in a very global company and the finance company, and the Korean managers. And sometimes the Korean manager said that sometimes we have American boss, and 1 year later we have Brazilian boss, and sometimes later we have Indian boss, because this is a global company. And Korean manager said, one day a Brazilian boss arrived as a new boss, and they asked us, feel free and let me have your opinion. Then what was the reaction from the Korean managers? They feel a little bit uncomfortable. Why? Because they thought a good leadership is making a decision. A good leadership is to know it's an order. This is the way that we are accustomed to. So this is the way that we are, Korean country, like a high power distance is used to. And also, that has worked. In the 1960s and 1970s, this is the way that high power distance culture that worked very well in Korean companies, because there was a boss, and boss made a decision, and there was a top-down decision process, and boss made a decision, every step followed it, they followed, there was a strong boss leadership, and the leadership is autocratic and paternalistic, and the boss was smart enough and strategic enough, and his men followed the boss decision, and this is the way that our company very well, very beautifully, and that's the way that drove our economic development. But how about now? Maybe this is a time for us to change, because now we have a new type of leadership to continue our economic growth sustainable. I think this is the topic that we will discuss in later classes. Let's get back to here, power. And also, this is the cultural differences when you are dealing with from different culture, that we need to adjust the way that we are using our English. So, English is now the common medium for the communication, not only the business, but all the different areas of the world. And also we should consider context with the power, and also we must consider these differences. This is the concept that from the Geert Hofstede introduced. And we will continue with this thing in the next session.